Irene Binini's recent book on possibility and necessity in the Time of Peter Abelard gives an excellent overview of the subject. I hope that this video will serve as a brief introduction and summary of some of the numerous aspects of Abelard's logic that Binini addresses in her book. In Peter Abelard's time, she explains, an intense debate was held on two aspects of modal logic. The first concerns the grammatical and syntactic structure of modal propositions, asking how this structure should be properly interpreted, which role the mode plays in it, and how this structure is related to that of non-modal categorical claims. The second set of problems concerns the signification of modal terms, such as possible and necessary, asking whether these names have denotation or not, and whether they should be predicated of things or rather of propositional entities. These problems were to a large extent inherited from a late antique context. As Robert Pinzani writes, Abelard's dialectics arises from a combination of logic in the Aristotelian tradition and grammar in the tradition of Priscian commentators. One reason Binini offers for the renewed interest in modal logic in this 12th century context is the arrival of new texts in the Latin-speaking West, including Aristotle's De Interpretatione and Boethius' De Hypotheticis Syllogismis, which focus closely on issues of possibility and necessity. Hitherto, discussions of logic in the Latin West had been founded chiefly upon Porphyry's commentaries on Aristotle's categories, a text which Porphyry presented as an introduction to all the parts of philosophy. Indeed, we should regard these logical works of Porphyry and Boethius as forming a philosophical background to this discussion of modality. Adverbial and nominal modal claims. The definition and understanding of modes in this time was indebted to Priscian's theory of adverbs, and this is key for the syntactical debates. Binini gives the standard definition of modes in this time as the words that qualify, determinant, a simple predication, stating in which way, quo modo, what is signified by a predicate inheres in what is signified by the subject. Thus, in grammatical terms, modes are adverbial, as in the example, Socrates reads well, or Socrates runs rapidly. Indeed, Abelard writes that both adverbs and nouns are said to be modes, modi, because they qualify the way, modum, of inherence or separation between terms of a proposition. Thus Socrates, the subject, runs, the predicate, rapidly, the mode. By including nouns in his definition, Abelard is referring to two standard grammatical forms of proposition, the nominal and the adverbial. In his view, and contrary to some of his contemporaries, this is not a real distinction, but the semantic content or deep structure of nominal and adverbial forms is the same. That being said, he considers the adverbial structure as the primitive and more appropriate form of modal claims, according to Binini. To give an example in English, a nominal modal proposition puts the mode in the nominative case, as in, it is possible for Socrates to run, whereas what Abelard regards as semantically the same proposition rendered adverbially goes, Socrates possibly runs. Proper and improper modes. In Abelard's logic, modal claims, both nominal and adverbial, are contrasted with non-modal claims such as Socrates reads, which are called simple or de puro inesse, because they affirm that a certain property is unqualifiedly, simpliciter, conjoined to a certain substance. As Binini puts it, simple categoricals state that, quote, a certain predicate inheres or does not inhere in a subject, whereas modals state in which way, quo modo, it inheres or does not inhere. For the logician Garland, the modes possibly, impossibly, necessarily, and contingently are called ways of inherence, modi inherentiae. It was Boethius' view that the signification of a verb stated with a certain modal qualification, e.g. to run rapidly, is always part of the signification of the same verb taken simpliciter, to run. Thus Socrates, the subject, runs rapidly, a modified or qualified predicate. Thus, in Binini's terms, for adherence to Boethius' view, the meanings of adverbs and predicate must first be united to form a single intellectus, that the qualification or modal adverb cannot be separated semantically from the predicate. This is a claim which Abelard finds problematic with regards to the mode possibly, For although we may truly say that Socrates possibly runs, we cannot infer from this that he runs simpliciter. To get around this issue, Abelard offers a distinction between proper and improper modes, such that, while not differing from proper modes with respect to their grammatical construction, improper modes have a different semantic role, as they are not qualifiers of a verb's meaning, and they do not posit any actual relation of inherence between predicate and subject. By these means he is able to maintain that propositions such as Socrates is possibly a bishop are true even though there is no actual relation between the things signified by predicate and subject. Synchronic and diachronic modal claims. As Binini observes, both ancient and early medieval modal philosophers typically read possibilities diachronically, that is, as evolving through time. In this paradigm, incompossible antecedent possibilities, such as that someone will be standing and not standing at some time t, may exist simultaneously with respect to some future moment in time. Once this moment becomes present, however, only one of these two possibilities will be actualized, to the exclusion of the other. Thus, in the diachronic framework, instead of remaining counterfactually possible as an unrealized potency, the incompossible possibility stops existing as a real possibility. Thus, on the whole, medieval logicians in this period reject a synchronic understanding of possibility, with some notable exceptions. Abelard, for example, in his analyses of certain propositions, does appear to factor synchronic modal claims into his thinking. Synchronic in this case means that there are counterfactual possibilities which can remain true propositionally even at the moment when the alternative contradictory fact has been realized. The classic example from this period which may be read in both ways is the proposition, "It is possible for Socrates while standing to sit." Diachronically, this can be understood to mean that it is possible for Socrates, who is standing at time t1, to sit down at time t2, where t2 differs from t1. Socrates' act of sitting down would therefore cancel out or extinguish the alternative possibility, which would be his continuing to stand. Synchronically, this proposition would be understood to mean that it is possible for Socrates, who is standing at time t, to sit at t. The truth of this proposition rests on the assumption that the alternative contradictory possibility remains concurrently with an actual state of affairs or fact. An example in which Abelard is even more explicit about his belief in the validity of synchronic modal claims is the proposition, "It is possible for a blind man to see." He maintains the validity of this proposition even as he excludes a diachronic reading of it, stating, "But it is entirely impossible that someone who is blind or anyone else might see after he is blind, that is, that after he has become blind he might recover his vision. We concede thus that someone who is blind might, without qualification, see, because he might have seen in such a way that he never became blind, just as others do. For him to be able to see after he is blind is, however, not possible." Thus, as Binini observes, the possibility of the blind to see does not refer to a time other than that in which the man is actually blind. This possibility, consistent with Abelard's understanding, is predicated of the blind man qua human being, that is, it relies on Abelard's definition of possibility as that which is non-repugnant to nature. We will look at what this term non-repugnant to nature may mean in the next section. Possibility as compatibility with nature. 12th century logicians wanted to speak about things having certain possibilities or necessities without committing to the existence of either modal properties or these properties' bearers, and in order to do so, they unanimously ruled out the idea that modal nouns denote something existing in substances. They thus rejected the Aristotelian understanding of possibilities as active or passive potencies possessed by a subject. Abelard in particular regarded the term possible as expressing a non-incompatibility with nature, non-repugnantia naturae, whereas necessary is predicated of something that nature requires, natura exigitur. Abelard's view of possibility as non-repugnancy with nature proposes that what is possible for one individual must also be possible for all other members of the same species. And Binini adds to this that these texts tend to speak of natures referring not to individuals but to natural kinds, talking for instance of natura animalis or natura hominis. In his understanding of natures, Abelard followed Porphyry's definition of nature as a bundle of properties held in common between members of a species. We cannot now get into the wider issues of the ontological status of Abelard's references to natures, because it would take us too far afield into another larger debate during his lifetime about the status of universals. On the whole, however, and typical of its time, Abelard's logic tries to mediate between concrete subjects and the abstract general terms which we use to predicate those subjects, with reference to the tree of Porphyry. Binini observes that Abelard is fundamentally concerned with de re or de rebus propositions, that is, propositions referring to actual things, and opposes this type of proposition to the de sensu or de dicto propositions, meaning those which refer to the merely semantic content of a claim without reference to concrete realities. Indeed, Abelard has been credited as one of the early exponents of this de re de dicto distinction in logic. Summing up this approach, Marenbon writes that Abelard advocates for a modal paradigm that is based on the notion of possibility for rather than of possibility that. In other words, it is actual existent individuals for whom a proposition may be true that Abelard is chiefly concerned with, rather than possible states of affairs or possible worlds that may be valid. This preference for the concrete and the individual is consistent with the attention Abelard gives to the subtle distinctions between predication at different levels of being. This is especially clear in the distinction he draws between determinate potencies and simple potencies, which Binini outlines in her book in some detail. In Abelard's writing, these are also termed potentiae naturales and potentiae determinatae. Determinate potencies are defined by the conditions in which they could be actualized, identified at the level of individuals, admit degrees, and are dynamic and subject to variation. Whereas simple potencies are somewhat independent of their realizability, identified at the level of species and natures, do not admit degrees or grades, and are unchangeable and unrelated to any factors except specific natures. When we say that determinate potencies admit degrees, this is a natural consequence of the status of the subject, which is the individual. For example, Socrates qua human being has the simple potency to run, but Socrates qua Socrates may have the determinate potency to run slowly or rapidly, according to his particular abilities. This potency is also subject to variation, insofar as Socrates himself is always changing. The simple potency that a human being qua human being has to run, by contrast, cannot be validly qualified except with reference to particulars. It is important to reiterate that, in keeping with the Porphyrian tree, these determinate potencies are a subset of the simple potencies, hence their respective applications at the level of the individual and at the level of species. Finally, these two types of potency can lead to different kinds of modal claims, although these may not always be obviously signified syntactically. It would thus appear that there is a degree of interpretation required to discern what kind of predication is at work, since this distinction is not baked into the syntax of modal propositions. Rather, the distinction is introduced at the deeper semantic level in order to sort out certain ambiguities.